everyone. Please continue to go through the food line there and help yourself. I'm Professor Roy Gardner. I'm the director of Stetson's Institute for Biodiversity, Law, and Policy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's opening Edward and Bonnie Foreman Biodiversity Lecture. The purpose of the lecture series is to foster a dialogue among students, academics, attorneys, policymakers, environmental scientists, and other stakeholders. The lecture series is made possible through the generous support of Bonnie Foreman, a member of the College of Law's Board of Overseers and the university's Board of Trustees. Bonnie is a great friend and supporter of Stetson, so I'd like to take this moment to thank her for. And I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to introduce today's speaker, Jason Lauritsen. We first met when he was the director of Audubon's Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Who has been to the sanctuary? Who's been to Corkscrew? All right, so now everybody else has something on their to-do list. I really recommend it. And so at that point, he then shared his knowledge about wood storks with our environmental research and writing class. Jason is now the executive director of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, where he implements the vision and mission of the organization to connect, protect, and restore essential conservation habitat statewide. In addition to wood stork recovery in the Western Everglades, Jason's expertise includes environmental conservation and restoration, land management science, and wetland protection. He has a master's in science education from the University of Iowa and a bachelor's in animal ecology from Iowa State University. Internationally, he has worked as a rainforest guide in Ecuador and served as a delegate to China as part of a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service exchange program. But today, he's going to be talking about issues closer to home, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and its beauty, but also how it's threatened. I would expect also touching upon the toll roads, the proposed toll roads. So the lecture is incredibly timely and critically important, and I expect that we'll also have the opportunity to hear about how you can get involved in trying to protect Florida's natural resources. Please welcome Jason Lauritsen.
Well, first, thanks for having me. Thanks for showing up. It's a pleasure to be here at Stetson. I hope at the end of this you know more about Florida and ways you can get involved in how the natural areas affect your quality of life. An author that's been very inspirational to me is named Wendell Berry, and he took the golden rule and adapted it to conservation. So I kind of consider it the golden rule of conservation. He said, "Do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you." And I think it's perfect. And I'd like you to think about that. Just grab that quote, stick it. It's easy to remember. But think about not just the physiological downstream, not just a geographic downstream, but also generationally downstream. The decisions that we make as a community, as individuals, have impacts not just to our physical neighbors, but also downstream in time. And what I hope we can do as a state is to recognize that we're really sort of in a race against time. We have 1,000 people a day that are moving to the state. It's a lot of people. And we do not have the kind of planning process that can accommodate those people while still maintaining the quality of life, our natural environment, the health and diversity of our wildlife and wild places. And we need to do that. It's not a matter of people seeking intentionally to destroy those values, but it's really a matter of ignorance and a lack of coordination. So my hope through this talk here over lunch is that at the end of this you'll understand a little bit more about why it's important to do that and what some solutions are. And one of the solutions is the Florida Wildlife Corridor. The Florida Wildlife Corridor really is two things, but both of those involve a solution to this problem. The problem of being able to accommodate both growth and the quality of our natural environment. So I guess I have a slide advancer here. Not stuck on the opening slide the whole time. So the Florida Wildlife Corridor is not just a solution, it's also a physical, geographic reality. There are 16.7 million acres throughout Florida that represent a connected landscape that's here right now. But it's not all protected. About 9 million acres of that Florida Wildlife Corridor is protected, and then another 6.9 million acres remains unprotected. I think I said almost 10 million is protected. So that 10 million acres is reflected in our 43 major springs in Florida, our 175 state parks, the Everglades National Park, Big Cypress National Preserve, all of these fantastic, outstanding Florida waterways that are already protected. So there's nearly 10 million acres that are protected, but there's a lot that remains unprotected, creating that link. There are 111 bottlenecks in there where the corridor that remains is not only unprotected, but incredibly compressed in space. And so again, when we look at this race against the clock, just to frame that problem, 1,000 people a day, by 2070, you'll see this theme coming up throughout the lunch. By 2070, that's 11 million more people in the state of Florida. Right now we have 22 million, we'll grow to 33 million. To put that in another context, the state of, if the entire population of the state of Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota moved to Florida, that's what it is. 11 million people total live in those 4 states. If everybody picked up and moved to Florida, that's what Florida's going to look like by 2070. So we obviously have to plan to accommodate that kind of growth. So not only is it a geographic representation on the map of quality habitat, but we're also a nonprofit organization. And we work to share the need for a protected and connected corridor with elected officials, with decision makers, with the agencies, with the general public, the voting public, and with kids. So that as we plan, there's support behind that plan so that things will actually get done. And the way you may recognize the Florida Wildlife Corridor is through our expedition films. We've put out so far 3 films. The first one was the longest one, 100 days, 1,000 miles from Florida Bay all the way up to Okefenokee. That was in 2012. In 2015 was the next one, which was the Forgotten Coast. It's played routinely on PBS here, so you might have already seen it, or you might see it at some time in the future. The latest one, The Last Green Thread, you can Google it. thelastgreenthread.com will take you to the film webpage. You can watch the trailer, or you can click a link to go see the full film. It's a short documentary on that expedition. It's 17 minutes long. Brilliant cinematography done by Grizzly Creek. And we're in the process of planning our next one called The Ranch to Ridge 2019. That's just a working title, but that will be in October through the Lake Wells Ridge area. So again, we're trying to educate and move public sentiment to recognize the importance of protecting this. We're also involved in current efforts to identify solutions for the state to maintain these values. I sit on the MCOR's, two of the MCOR's task forces. We can talk a little bit more about that. Again, trying to bring voice to decision-making bodies on why we need to protect this. We work with agencies routinely to advise and counsel them on what things need to be done, whether it's watershed protection or land acquisitions. And then we work with coalitions of environmental organizations. This O2O, Regional Conservation Planning Program, is a group of 6 conservation organizations that are working to protect the Osceola to Ocala National Forest Corridor. That's part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but broken up into segments. This is one that's gaining some traction. So here's that beautiful Florida Wildlife Corridor. Nice watercolor showing you that connected environment. And in 1847, Buckingham Smith, a lawyer from St. Augustine, was commissioned by the U.S. Treasury Secretary to do a reconnaissance mission in South Florida, in the Everglades. He goes down, he spends several months, he interviews a number of individuals, military people, people with experience on the land, engineers, to answer two questions, part of his commission. Can we drain the Everglades? And if we can, should we? And if you haven't already read the quote, I'm going to read it. This is what he writes in the opening pages of his report to Congress the following year in 1848. The appearance of the interior of the Everglades is unlike that of any region of which I have ever heard. And certainly it is in some respects the most remarkable on this continent. The profound and wild solitude of the place, the solemn silence that pervades it, add to awakened and excited curiosity, feelings bordering on awe. I was surprised to see that in there, knowing how the story turned out. Here's a person who expresses in this soaring rhetoric some of the feelings I feel as a conservation person. Thinking, maybe this guy gets it. Maybe he gets it. He appreciates the aesthetic beauty of it. How could you not? The wildlife, the landscape, it's incredible. But beyond aesthetics, you continue flipping pages and you get this part where Buckingham Smith says, but the practical man, and you know you're in for a change, but the practical man, and he goes on to write this. The Everglades are now suitable only for the haunt of noxious vermin or the resort of pestilent reptiles. The statesmen, whose exertions shall cause the millions of acres they contain, now worse than worthless, to teem with the products of agricultural industry, to be changed into a garden in which can be reared many and various exotics. That man will merit a high place in public favor, not only with his own generation, but with posterity. And in reading his report and all the attendant interviews that he did and the letters that he received, he tried to do a thorough job. I mean, his report represented the best available science and understanding of the Everglades. And his conclusion was, yeah, we should drain it. And if you do, Congress, you'll be heroes forever. But there's more to the story. He lacked a real depth of understanding of the tens of thousands of relationships and interactions that make the Everglades a functioning ecosystem. He didn't understand that. Science had not caught up with it. Okay, it's pretty, but I don't see any other value to it. So when you watch our films, when you look at the photography and you recognize and resonate with the beauty, you have to understand you can't stop there. My all-time favorite quote is a Da Vinci quote. One has no right to love or hate anything if one has not acquired a thorough knowledge of its nature. Great love springs from great knowledge of the beloved object. If one knows it but little, one will love it but little or not at all. It's not enough just to see some pictures and appreciate it, put it on a screensaver, repost it on Instagram. If you don't understand it, you're liable, perhaps unintentionally, to make a decision that's going to compromise and foreclose on that being around for future generations. So what we try to do is to bring not only the art and the aesthetics to bear, but also the science, so that people can understand how it works in those tens of thousands of interactions. Aldo Leopold's one of my favorite conservation biologists, and he writes in his book, The Sam County Almanac, that there are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One, that you come to think that your breakfast comes from the grocery, and the second, that your heat comes from the furnace. What he's describing in that book is how important it is to have a thorough knowledge of the land and what puts food on your plate, and how those things, your quality of life, is directly dependent upon the health and quality of your environment. And the farther you are removed from that connection, the more likely you are to make those kinds of mistakes that will result in environmental degradation and a decreasing quality of life. We see that with red tide. It's pretty obvious. In many ways, we can see that kind of catching up to us, those chickens coming home to roost. So one of the things that we do as an organization is we work with a lot of the landowners, multi-generational ranchers, who are protecting green space as they provide an income for their family and their community. A lot of them are working on getting conservation easements to make sure that their ranches stay open land and retain those conservation values and don't become rooftops and pavement. It's an incredibly important thing, because 6 6.9 million acres is a lot of acres to purchase outright. We need to have alternate solutions to creating that protected and connected corridor. So again, the first expedition walked, paddled, and biked from the tip of Florida to Georgia, putting on the people's public conscience the fact that there's a corridor out there, just a lot of it's not protected. And wildlife uses that. It's a beautiful state. Those springs, the manatees, the aquatic corridors that are also very much a part of what we do. Our gopher tortoises, red-cockaded woodpeckers. Roy mentioned that I used to work at Corkscrew, one of the best places in Florida to go. If you haven't been there, please do. This is the super ghost. There's a great documentary put out by Grizzly Creek Films about the ghost orchid and the science and what little we know. Again, these interactions that are fascinating. Barred owls, Florida panther. This wasn't in a zoo. This was also at Corkscrew. A guy sitting on a porch, having a cup of tea, waiting for the sun to go down so he could go and put up his light trap and white sheet to go photograph moths in the bald cypress. He's sitting there with his wife. And up walks this pair of panthers. This is a dominant male panther. You can see the scars from his fights on his face. They're looking at him. He's looking at them. Steve takes a couple of pictures. I love this shot. This is a wild Florida panther. Just taking in Steve Reynolds. Painted buntings. And then, of course, our ranch lands. Florida's trails, outstanding Florida waters, the campgrounds. It's an amazing state with tremendous repositories of natural beauty and biodiversity. Things that are not guaranteed if we don't protect the corridor. These little pockets, sometimes fairly large expanses of acreage, are special and have great assortments of wildlife. These are tree swallows mobbing a wax myrtle bush. Any guesses? Baby black vultures. Florida's springs. So again, if all we appreciate is the beauty and we don't understand how it works, we're going to make the wrong decisions. So take a look at time. I like to think of this as taking advantage of the long lens of history and the fine focus of science as we progress to try to find solutions. So looking at Bonita Springs and what was then called the Corkscrew River in 1950, almost devoid of houses, a little town starting to pop up in 1950. By 2018, dramatically changed. 60 years. If you look at the changes based on habitat types, shallow wetland changes. On the left, you can see Corkscrew in the middle. The pink represents shallow shore hydroperiod wetlands, and how just over the course of time, not paying attention to it, development removed 82% of wet prairies and 70% of the shore hydroperiod wetlands. So disproportionate impacts, which ultimately can mess up the ecosystem and the ecology. So how we grow, those 1,000 people a day are going to continue to move. Where we put them, how we do zoning, where we encourage conservation easements and land acquisitions is going to make a difference between a connected Florida or fragmented Florida. The map on the right shows the trend. By 2070, that's what Florida will look like if we don't reach out and make sure that we're directing and protecting growth away from the corridor. So again, educating people to the importance of that requires some science, some understanding. Our natural system provides these ecological services, which we benefit from, but also economics as well. We had 100 million people visit Florida last year, resulting in outdoor recreation and tourism, an economic benefit of almost $43 billion for our state. Maybe you don't care about red-cockaded woodpeckers, but we're a tourism-based economy, and people care about that. That represents 347,000 jobs. So if people aren't speaking the language of biology, biology and botany and ecosystems, they'll understand the tourism connection. Within that area around Corkscrew, there was a loss of 35% of the wetlands, which represents $1.9 billion lost each year in ecological services, just within a 30-kilometer radius around Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. If you multiply that across the state, you'll see we're losing billions and billions of dollars a year in ecological services because we're losing connectivity. We're not protecting our watersheds. Some of the impacts are hard to see. In this picture, there are two caterpillars right there, munching on cypress needles. Following the chain of why this is important to me was fascinating. In the fall, these caterpillars emerge en masse and munch away on the leaves, sometimes nearly defoliating entire cypress heads. And when they're doing that, these little tiny inchworm-like caterpillars are also feeding prothonotary warblers and all sorts of other songbirds as they're fattening up for their migration south. Your blue-gray gnatcatchers and your palm warblers as well, all feeding on these little mixed flocks of warblers. A lot of people who care about the warblers, but wouldn't think twice about those caterpillars. So 2 years ago, Irma comes in, September, wipes out all of the foliage on those cypress trees. Not a shred of cypress needles left on the forest at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. No cypress looper caterpillars. No capacity to fatten up those warblers as they migrate south. What's the impact of more intense and more frequent hurricanes and storms? It has some other effects that take some understanding to know about. Not only the bird life, but also those caterpillars provide a host for a parasitic wasp called Coleicthnumon navis. It only has a Latin name as far as I know. But this wasp lays an egg in the caterpillar. That caterpillar larva, or that caterpillar is the food for the larva, and it emerges an adult, and it's an important native pollinator for lots of different species of flowers in our environment in South Florida. So when you end up tinkering with the frequency and severity of storms and you're impacting these caterpillars, you're impacting a whole host of other things. There's these connections that we just don't understand. So it's important, again, to get that knowledge. But while you're doing that, don't wait. Let's protect. So we use the black bear and the Florida panther as sort of totems to show people the importance of protecting and connecting these landscapes and these habitats. Joe Guthrie is a bear biologist who collared a bear several years ago. This bear was identified as M34, and he tracked it with that GPS collar. It was a young male, and it went on a walkabout. In the course of 2 months, it traveled 530 miles, more than that, around the state of Florida, bumping into I-4s, taking several days trying to find a way to cross what's a pretty impermeable barrier. There is a box culvert in there that is intended to be a way for wildlife to get through, but this bear couldn't find it. So it turned back south and did another 200-mile trip before it finally settled on a place to live. Dispersal ecology, having that understanding, and what's it take to have a bear population survive and thrive? How can we make these special charismatic creatures sustainable? You need to think about their biology and have an understanding about that. There are 7 bear populations in Florida. The more isolated a population comes, the less chance there is for it to exchange genetic diversity with other subpopulations of black bears. You can get bottlenecking, and you can get the kind of genetic problems that the Florida panther had. You don't want to have those kinds of costly impacts to those populations, because fixing that becomes expensive and sometimes controversial. The changes to the Endangered Species Act recently, when they're looking at the economics of recovering a species, come into play. The more fragmented we get, the higher it's going to cost us to protect these species. So connectivity is critical for black bears, keeping that landscape connected. Same thing with panthers. This Florida panther was photographed on Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. When you visit the sanctuary, you see 1/15 of the entire size of the sanctuary. Many times while there, I would ask people, how many panthers you think Corkscrews can satisfy? The lowest number I ever heard was 2 or 3. Many people are saying, I don't know, 5, 10 panthers live here. One adult male Florida panther defends a territory that's 200 square miles in size. Corkscrew is 20 square miles. You need 10 corkscrew swamp sanctuaries to satisfy the home range demands of one dominant male panther. This, as big as it seems when you're standing in the middle of it, is not nearly enough. If we want to continue to keep those kinds of species around for future generations, we need to think about what's across the fence and work with these neighboring landowners, the ranches, the mitigation banks, and figure out how can we work together to maintain these impermeable barriers that these bears and these panthers cross. A 4-strand or 5-strand barbed wire fence is no problem for our wildlife. They don't know that that's not a preserve on the other side. They're going to go there. This, however, is an impermeable barrier, a wide, solid highway. So as we build these things, as we improve them, widen them, add intersections and interchanges, what can we do to restore it? To put wildlife underpasses in. You see great habitat on either side of this road. And if you don't realize the fact that this becomes a fragmentation artifact and prevents the wildlife from being able to cross there. One of the bills that's currently under consideration by the federal legislature right now, it's a transportation bill. There's a statistic in there that cites that wildlife automobile impacts cost our country $33.8 billion a year. There's an economic cost to not putting in wildlife crossings, let alone the loss of the species themselves. And again, Wendellberry and our future. Right? We owe it to future generations to look after these wild places. So how do you get involved? Obviously, you can't click these links on a PowerPoint presentation, but we do have at the table back there a sign-up sheet for our newsletter. We also have little cards to connect with us on Instagram or Facebook. And if you go on our Facebook or our Instagram account in the last couple of weeks, we posted live links to these bills, the 3 bills I'm going to talk about here. So you can learn more about the bill. You can find out about the people who are sponsoring the bill. In this case, this is Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2019. At the time I wrote this, it had 100 sponsors. I got an alert today saying that there's changes in the sponsorship, so I imagine that's a bigger number now. Pretty popular bill. Going to help with adding some funding for nationwide for endangered species. And the next one, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, has one Florida sponsor, which I'd encourage you to just send them a note and say thank you for sponsoring this bill. There are a number of Florida legislators that are on committees that are reviewing this bill, and we'd like to see it get out of committee. This is the second time this bill's been offered up for consideration, but it didn't make it out of committee the last time for a vote. We'd love to have you get in touch with these guys to make sure that they know it matters to us. So get involved that way. There's another one that probably will pass. There's a pretty good chance that that transportation bill will pass. And it has quite a bit of money in there that is working on pilots for improving permeability of our roadways systems by creating wildlife underpasses. So I love seeing these kinds of elements in what would traditionally not be a wildlife corridor bill included. There's recognition that we need to do something and we need to do it differently as we build and as we grow. And the last thing, with regard to action and activity, is this MCORS process. Florida State Legislature and the governor signed a bill this past winter that's a toll road. It's known as a toll road bill. And right now there are 3 task forces that have been assembled with pretty broad representation of various stakeholder groups. And they're in the process, I'm on 2 of the 3. We are in the process of gathering public input and trying to come up with recommendations that will guide the eventual alignments and process by which our state will develop future infrastructure. We're not drawing the lines on the map, but we're providing guidelines. The Florida Wildlife Corridor is on there to make sure that everybody around that table that's in that decision-making process has an understanding of the value and importance of wildlife corridors and connectivity, and to make sure that as we grow, we don't sever those. Now, bills similar to this have come forward in the past, but they didn't have that wildlife corridor component. This is the first time that this issue of road building and toll roads has also included strongly in their conservation. So we're hoping to step up and be heard. There were public comment periods at the first MCOR's task force meeting. 35 of the 36 public comments all mentioned the importance of wildlife corridors. That's great. We like to keep that going at every meeting, people to just share how important these connections are for the future. So you've seen the first two maps, where we are now, the map in the middle, the trend for growth by 2070, and the map on the right shows the alternate. This map shows if we did protect the corridor, we could still accommodate that 33 million people, but we could maintain connectivity in a meaningful way. So our hope, again, is through this planning process to push our leadership to recognize and instill ecological values for future generations, and it's possible. A couple of slides up here that just show the study area. This is the largest of the study areas. It's the Southwest Central Florida connector, and then the North Connector, and then the Sun Coast. So there are 3 study areas that are under consideration. And if you want to take a look at the website, it's floridamcors.com. You can get all the information and study up on it, or you can leave your feedback. We'd love to have you weigh in and share what your thoughts are. Or you can email us at floridawildlifecorridor@gmail.com, and we'll share that information at the task force. And of course, if you're able to attend any of those task force meetings and share your comments at the public comment period at the end in person, that would be fantastic. The last thing you can do is continue to invest in getting to know your wild Florida. Go hike the Florida Trail. Get out in a swamp. Go camping. Renew your connection to the environment. Photography, grab some binoculars, do some birding. If you're part of one of the Florida wildflower clubs or gardening clubs, do some paddling. It's a beautiful state. And just because we've protected 9 million acres of it doesn't mean that it's going to remain filled with populations of wildlife that are sustainable. So we hope you guys can get involved. You can get involved with us at the Florida Wildlife Corridor and make your voices heard. Happy to take any questions if there's time. I don't know.
There is time. Yes, and thank you for that wonderful talk. I mean, and one of the things that I find inspiring is that we do have so much that's already protected, and that there is the opportunity to link this up. So it's not. Sometimes in the environmental area, it's all just sort of doom and gloom, but it's nice to hear about opportunities to actually resolve and solve some of these problems. Questions or comments?
How is the water level rise going to affect your plans for extending the corridor?
That's a really good question. I imagine there are several ways I could approach answering the question, but how does the sea level rise pretend to impact the corridor? One of the things that it does is it underscores the importance of having this connectivity. We have something like $21 billion assigned for Everglades restoration. We're hoping to restore the Everglades. And as sea level rises, it's such a low landscape. As sea level rises, it has the potential to swallow quite a bit of the southern area of our beautiful Everglades. Yeah. So if we don't have connectivity in places for not just panthers and bears, but for the plant communities also to adjust and adapt, go up gradient in salinity and hydroperiod, then we will lose that. So we need to have areas north of the Everglades and the water conservation areas and the Everglades agricultural areas that are capable of supporting that kind of uphill migration for that. And that's the most obvious, but everywhere we have coastal natural areas like that, those are some of the most popular places for communities to spring up. And we've lost a lot of our coastal wetlands and our coastal scrub. So wherever we have those connections remaining, we should really prioritize that and stay out of it. So again, it's not just a wildlife, but it's entire plant communities that we need to identify as having a need to be able to migrate uphill and up gradient. So thanks for the question. It's good.
Thank you. It's a great talk. This is a law school, and apart from the legislation that you've referenced and that you've had a role in writing, what particular law not included in that proposed legislation is vitally important to see passed in the near term?
What legislation aside from those three is vital? I would say that from Florida's standpoint, every year Florida Forever and Rural and Family Lands budgets come up within the legislation discussions, and those are critical. We haven't seen the Land and Water Initiative funds that were set aside and voted on in an amendment a few years back really spent the way I think a lot of us thought they would be. Those, from the public sentiment standpoint, were intended to be invested in primarily land acquisition and conservation easements. So what we would like to see is some follow through with the intent of that amendment so that we're making more gains, because again, this is a race. So acquiring land and easing that land. We haven't seen as much rural and family lands funding. We really have seen next to no rural and family lands funding in the last couple of budget cycles. And we'd love to see that number increase as well. So I'm sure there are other places I could look up for you, but those are the two that come to mind. Is there a question over here?
Can you speak to any of the incentives in place or that are being looked at to incentivize private landowners to move them towards conservation?
Absolutely. So as far as incentives go, these conservation easements are not a one-size-fits-all, but they can be they're written up to reflect the needs and interests of the landowner. So one of the things that I found, I don't know if this exactly addresses your question. You can grab me afterwards if it doesn't. But conservation easements are really popular among a lot of the ranching community. But actually getting a valuation that makes it worth their while is sometimes the tricky spot. I spoke to a guy. I've actually been, in planning our expedition, I've been working with a lot of landowners, and I asked them, do you have a conservation easement? Have you ever tried to pursue a conservation easement? Everyone that didn't have one had tried to pursue one in the past. And they've just been denied, or they've gotten a score back that was too low. So one of the things that we do as an organization is try to provide some of the rationale for why this is important. These are in the Florida Wildlife Corridor. They have forests and wetlands and open lands that provide great connections. So to give them some of the tools so that they can get a kind of score that will allow them to ease their property and lock it in for conservation. That's the tricky part. The incentives for them are, can I afford to do this? One of the things that also happens, how a lot of these farmers and ranchers are making ends meet in many cases, is they will lease their land for hunting. And you have a hunting community which will pay quite a bit of money to lease that land. And I've heard stories from these ranchers that say, you know what, that's the only reason I can keep this piece of property, because I don't have it in orange groves or in tomato fields. It's natural land. And if I can't get a hunting lease on this, I have to sell it. And who's going to buy it if you can't get, for conservation, if you can't get that conservation value in there? So there are other solutions and ways these guys hang on to it, but most of those multi-generational ranchers, they don't want to see it turning into rooftops.
The multi-generational ranchers and the hunters, as you mentioned, friends of the wildlife corridor, but my worry is that so much of the land now, agricultural land as well as ranching land, is held by huge, large corporations. And it seems to me they have much less incentive to enter into a conservation easement. The logging in the north, ranching in the central part, down the south with agriculture, including the sugarcane industry. What is that a big problem? Or am I just imagining that? And if so, how do you approach big corporates?
That's a tough question to answer, in part because there are different parties at play. In some cases, there are large land-holding corporations that do a lot of farming that are very open to protecting legacies. Maybe not for every acre, but there are certain special properties that those families, despite the fact that they're large corporations, are invested to protect. There are others that I haven't seen that from. I haven't always seen that same legacy appreciation for the land. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Each of these individuals or corporations is sort of managed and operated in different ways. But I would say that there are some that have not shown an inclination to come to the negotiating table because they don't have to. And then there are others that very much would like to. And part of their personal family legacy is identified with helping to protect the wildlife that they grew up loving. So.
I just want to thank you for that presentation as well, but I'm curious, how do they go about measuring the conservation value in general?
When I was at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, we applied for a 2,800 acre property north of the sanctuary outside of conservation land that was mostly orange grove, and we wanted it adopted into Florida forever. And so the land person and our policy person got together and we wrote the rationale for why this is important, and we involved hydrologists and other area experts around in creating this rationale for why should we protect this piece of property. And it was one of the first properties that was adopted, and I think it might have been the first property that was majority citrus grove. Usually Florida Forever is pasture and wetlands. But there's a rationale for having those headwaters areas protected and conserved because of how they relate and influence the downstream watershed and already protected and preserved land. So what happened was we wrote that, we sent it up to the FDEP, and they brought together a group to come down and listen to our presentation, and then we went out on a field trip and gave them a tour of the property, and they got a chance to see the values that were there and hear and ask questions. So they have a team of experts from a variety of different disciplines that goes and sees the land firsthand. They have an opportunity then to ask further questions, and there are a couple of meetings that go on with ARC, and then they make a determination as to whether or not they're going to adopt your property into Florida Forever. I don't know if it works the same in the rural and family lands process, but either fee simple acquisition or conservation easements often go through that kind of a process. I was speaking with someone yesterday and this morning before just about trying to help them reevaluate their property because they had such a low score. My guess is that they had hired a law firm to help them through this process, but they may not have known all of the ins and outs of what these agencies were looking for to recognize the real ecological values that property represented, because it's a really fantastic piece of property. So connecting the legal team that's helping to create that with the scientists and the resource managers and the folks that understand the ecological values is important to being able to provide a rationale that will eventually be recognized and awarded.
Yes, Yes, sir. Regarding the scope of your organization, how does it overlap with the other environmental issues currently in the state? For instance, just pervasive pollution and especially invasive species. Do you have any sort of synergy with those issues, or do you contemplate them in the scope of your organization?
I'm not sure if I heard all of your questions, so let me rephrase what I heard. Does our organization sort of overlap into some of the other conservation environmental areas? I heard you mention invasive species.
Are involved with the scope of your organization, and how do you contemplate or deal with that?
Yeah. There's definite overlap, and our organization is really laser focused on protecting the habitat, just getting it locked down in some kind of a conservation easement or acquisition. And we try not to wade too far into the political controversies. However, I specifically recognize that invasive species issues are a major hurdle for land acquisition for state and federal agencies, because you have a price tag on managing that land. And I've talked to people with the conservation easements as well, saying they don't want to purchase this property outright. They'll only conservation easement if we'll take care of the invasive species, because they don't want that burden of invasive species on the property. The counter argument to that is, what if you don't manage your invasive species? What if you allow those species to continue? Primrose willow, coastal plains willow, some of those invasive species have significant impacts on your hydrology. And when you impact the hydrology, you end up with drought stress, saltwater intrusion, and more severe and frequent wildfires, which has significant public costs. So actually, the economic calculus is such that if you don't manage the land properly, then the public in a different way is going to pay the price, and a greater price than had you actually gone through and done the appropriate management. So having those kinds of questions out there so that people can understand what really is the full economic picture here of managing versus not managing this property for invasive species, that's missing a lot of times from the argument. But I love to sit down with the various agencies and NGOs and have these kinds of conversations to help people build a better argument for conservation. Thank you for the question.
So I will take the opportunity for the last question. So in your time with the Florida Wildlife Corridor and Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, what was your most memorable experience in the field?
Well, if you talk to my buddies, they'd say I got lost. I didn't really get lost. I mean, there was some disagreement of where we were. Yeah, I went on a famed 2-hour hike that turned out to be 8 hours. Ended up climbing a tree in the middle of Corkscrew. It was a cloudy day. I didn't have a GPS. We had one radio to call in. That's it. And at one point, I'm up a tree in the middle of a pond apple slough trying to see a landmark of some kind. We had radioed in, and somebody was driving the roads at Corkscrew honking. I couldn't hear a thing. A plane goes overhead. We hear the plane. Call down on the plane. So one of our party calls the guy in the truck and said, "What direction is the plane going?" And that's how we got our bearings and ended up making our way out. But that was amazing. I loved it. A buddy of mine from the Midwest, is his first experience in the swamp. He was miserable. The second day I took him on the boardwalk, and he said, "This is how we should have done it." But I love it, getting out in there. I don't know if any of you have seen Max Stone's photography. One of the last trips I took out in the swamp was to go snorkeling in an alligator hole. And it's murky, dark, tannic water. We'd seen an alligator when we entered the hole, sitting at the top. And I thought, well, before we leave, I'll snorkeling across, see if I can't film that alligator. And it was so dark, I didn't see it until it was within touching distance, right over its hind legs. Kind of freaked me out a little bit. As much time as I spent around alligators, it just took off. Really cool. I mean, I have so many, Roy, but there's two.
Well, Jason, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.